They called it the Spanish donkey. A wooden wedge, 8 inches wide, sharp enough to split a woman in half. In 1629, under Bamberg Castle, Anna Schwarz was stripped naked, tied above it, and slowly lowered until the wood tore her body apart from below. The executioner took notes, not to stop her pain, but to time how long she could survive. Every scream was recorded. Every minute had value. Because in this system, torture wasn't about punishment. It was business. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The chamber smelled of iron, sweat, and burning oil. Anna's wrists were bound behind her back, her legs forced apart by ropes. Beneath her, the wedge waited. A simple piece of wood, yet designed with terrifying precision. It wasn't built to kill instantly. It was built to measure. When the rope slackened, gravity did the rest. The sharp edge pressed between her thighs, cutting slowly upward as her body weight drove it deeper. She gasped once, twice. Then the sound turned into something unrecognizable. Half sob, half animal. The guards didn't flinch. The clerk nearby dipped his quill in ink and wrote, "Time of descent, 2 minutes." No one in that room was there for mercy. The executioner's job wasn't to bring death quickly, but to prolong it with methodical care. If Anna fainted, they'd throw water in her face. If she struggled, they'd add weights to her ankles. 10 pounds at a time, enough to pull her down, but not enough to end her life. The pain had to last. That was the rule. And above it all, the church seal hung on the wall. This was an official sentence, sanctioned, witnessed, and filed. To the priests, it was purification. To the scribes, it was paperwork. But to the people who watched, it was a spectacle they'd never forget. When her body finally stopped moving, the chamber went silent. The clerk wrote one last line. Confession obtained. Property transferred. That was all it took. A signature, a death, and a new name on the deed to her land. Her execution had already been profitable before it even began. Her gold, her home, even her clothes had been listed in the ledgers of the court. The Spanish donkey was never about sin or salvation. It was about control. Control of women, of wealth, of fear itself. And Anna was only one of hundreds. Across Germany, France, and Spain, the same wedge waited for countless others, each recorded in the same cold handwriting. History would later call it torture. The church called it justice. But the truth sits somewhere deeper, carved into wood, written in ink, and buried with the bones that no one ever spoke of again. And this was just the beginning. Because soon, Europe would turn pain itself into an industry, a system where agony was engineered and faith was measured in screams. When sunlight entered the chamber through the narrow slit in the wall, it glinted off the stains. Brown streaks, blackened at the edges, each one a record of someone who had already paid the price. No prayers were said over those stains. They were not symbols of redemption, only evidence that the system worked. The Spanish donkey was kept like an altar. Every morning before a sentencing, the chamber attendants inspected the ropes, replaced the splintered beam if needed, and oiled the winch so that the descent remained smooth. The device had to work perfectly. Too much friction, and the rope might jerk, killing the victim too soon. Too little resistance, and the spectacle would end before the confession began. Every detail was maintenance of agony. Witness accounts describe the same routine across Europe. The accused stripped and bound, the wedge blessed with holy water, the priest reciting a verse while the executioner adjusted the ropes. Sometimes they would place the cross in front of the victim's face, not to comfort, but to remind her what awaited her soul if she refused to confess. The idea was simple: pain would purify. But what the church didn't say was that pain also paid. Once a woman was accused, her property was frozen. Her estate, livestock, jewelry, all seized, pending divine judgment. If she confessed, under torture or otherwise, the assets automatically transferred to the church's treasury. If she died without confessing, the same law applied. There was no outcome where the institution lost, only degrees of profit. This was the genius behind the device. The Spanish donkey wasn't just wood and iron. It was paperwork made physical, a way to turn faith into an accounting system. The wedge did not separate flesh from bone. It separated people from property. Letters from Bamberg's city clerk in 1628 mention the purchase of a new device of the Spanish design, approved by the bishop himself. Attached was an expense report, 2 florins for construction, 1 for transportation, 1 for repair of the ropes. Beside it, another note: recovered value from 3 executions, 12 acres and 2 homes. Profit ratio, 6:1. The device paid for itself in a single day. Pedro Ruiz's manual included sketches of the human pelvis, drawn in red ink. Each line precise, each note written like the language of a surgeon. But Ruiz wasn't a doctor. He was an accountant of souls. He described where to place the wedge, how to angle the body, how to read the signs of collapse. "Do not permit death before confession," he wrote. "Add weights gradually, no more than 40 pounds at once." He warned against compassion. He called mercy a waste of the divine instrument. What he didn't mention, but every executioner knew, was the sound. The low cracking of muscle fibers, the wet tearing as the body shifted under its own weight. Women screamed until their voices disappeared, replaced by short gasps and a hoarse wheezing. Sometimes they whispered prayers, sometimes they begged to be burned instead. The donkey was slower than fire. It could last 4 hours, sometimes 8. The record from one town in Würzburg lists a woman who survived 17 hours and 40 minutes. The note beside her name reads, "Steadfast until the end. Property, 1 mill, 1 vineyard." Executioners called the device merciful compared to the stake. To them, fire was too unpredictable. The donkey, by contrast, gave control, a clean, measurable rhythm. They could pause, adjust, resume. Pain became a process, and death a performance. Those who witnessed it never forgot. Even hardened soldiers described the sight as unbearable, but still, they came to watch. Public executions drew crowds. Vendors sold bread and wine outside the courthouse. Children perched on barrels to see better. Every community had one story. A woman they'd known, a neighbor, a widow, taken to the donkey. They spoke her name in whispers. as if saying it too loudly might summon the next accusation. And yet, the device spread. By the late 1500s, it appeared in France, Flanders, and southern Germany. Each region added its own refinements: iron fittings, foot restraints, a crank to adjust the descent more precisely. Craftsmen signed their work. Some even carved initials into the base. The same hands that built church pews built this. The same carpenters who shaped altars also shaped agony. When historians later unearthed the manuals and surviving devices, the craftsmanship shocked them. This wasn't crude barbarism. It was science, directed, deliberate, and organized under divine authority. Every cut of the wedge represented knowledge turned against compassion. In Bamberg's archive, there's one fragment of testimony from a young attendant who worked during Anna Schwarz's execution. He describes her silence near the end, when her voice was gone and she only moved her fingers, scraping the air as if trying to write something invisible. He said the clerk leaned in and whispered, "Just confess. It's almost over." But she couldn't speak anymore. Her mouth was open, and no sound came out. When it ended, they lowered her body onto a wooden board. Her eyes were still open. The executioner washed his hands, the priest signed the parchment, and the ledger was closed. A new entry was added to the tax roll that same day. Her land, 3 acres, 1 farmhouse, reassigned to the church for maintenance of faith. That's how the system worked. 1 scream at a time, 1 signature per death. The donkey wasn't just a torture device. It was the hinge between faith and finance, pain and paperwork. A perfect union of cruelty and order, efficient, legal, divine. And in the next chamber, carpenters were already sharpening a new wedge, ready for the next trial. Because in Bamberg, faith was never short on victims. By the time Anna Schwarz's ashes cooled, the paperwork of her death was already done. 1 clerk filed her confession, another her property transfer, and a third sealed the ledger with a wax mark of the church. Within 24 hours, her estate was officially absorbed into what the records called God's treasury. Her name disappeared from every local registry, replaced by a new entry, vacated through divine justice. No one questioned it. The system ran like a factory. Every accusation created a vacancy. Every vacancy created income. That was how the Inquisition learned to make pain profitable. To most people in 17th century Europe, torture was not horror. It was administration. It followed the same logic as taxes or harvest quotas. When the court needed funds, accusations rose. When debts were settled, silence returned. Faith had become a machine that ran on bodies. Inside that machine, the executioner was not the villain. He was an employee. He kept receipts for rope, oil, and wood. He submitted invoices for maintenance of devices and replacement of wedges. In some cities, he even paid rent for the chamber where he worked. There was no secrecy. It was part of civic accounting. The church's tribunals called it cleansing, but the ledgers used another word: inventory. Each condemned person was assigned a value, often estimated by the worth of their land or dowry. It was efficiency disguised as faith. Take the case of Margareta Herber, a widow who owned a textile workshop and 3 acres outside Bamberg. In 1628, she was accused of nightly communion with unclean spirits. Her trial lasted less than a day. 3 witnesses testified. 2 were drunkards promised wine. one a church scribe who had never met her. She was sentenced to the Spanish donkey. Before she even faced the wedge, her property was listed as pending acquisition. By the time she died, her land had already been sold to her late husband's brother at half its value. Margareta's case wasn't exceptional, it was the blueprint. Across Germany, France, and Flanders, the same pattern repeated. A woman with wealth, a sudden accusation, a quick confession under torture, then silence, and a transfer of deeds. It was a business model cloaked in holiness, and the Spanish donkey was the perfect tool to sustain it. Unlike burning or hanging, it left just enough time for a confession, enough time to make it voluntary, enough time to sign. Records from the bishopric of Würzburg mention an account book titled Expensae Purificationis, Expenses of Purification. It lists ropes, candles, guards, and food for prisoners. But next to those mundane costs is another column: recovered assets. The math was obscene. For every florin spent on torture, the church gained 10 from confiscations. Pain, in their hands, was not chaos. It was arithmetic. But the bureaucracy didn't just record pain, it standardized it. When the first manuals were written for inquisitors, they outlined not just the theology, but the method. When to begin, how long to continue, and when to stop before death. The manuals read like surgical instructions. Observe her breath. If it becomes short, pause the descent. Allow her to recover enough to speak, then resume. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was control. Pain was a means of extracting obedience, not just from the victim, but from the entire town watching. Every scream reminded the others how quickly purity could become accusation. Everybody on the donkey was a sermon without words, and people learned. They learned to bow lower in church, to give more offerings, to silence rumors before they reached the wrong ears. Fear became its own form of worship. The church didn't need to hunt witches forever, only long enough to teach obedience. In Bamberg's town archive, one scribe left a private note in the margin of an execution record. He wrote, "I heard her whisper to God, but the sound did not rise." And beside it, another line. They said justice was done. Those few words reveal what official records could not. That even within the system, some knew it was wrong. But knowing was dangerous. Speaking was suicide. And so, silence became the final law. The Spanish donkey was only one instrument among many, but it represented the essence of the Inquisition's logic. It was not about purging sin. It was about proving that pain could be written, signed, and monetized. The more systematic the suffering, the more legitimate it looked. Every clean document made every dirty act invisible. By the mid-1600s, entire networks of torture chambers operated like franchises. Each had a ledger, a staff, and a supply chain. Carpenters built wedges to standardize specifications. Rope makers received bulk orders. Even the candle makers profited. Every confession required light. There was no part of the economy untouched by pain. What began as faith had become logistics. Bodies moved like goods. Death followed protocol. It was all written, all approved, all signed in God's name. And yet, beneath the numbers and ink, there were still human sounds, gasps, cries, whispers, echoes of people who had believed that confession might save them. Instead, it only turned them into transactions. But something was beginning to shift. Not everyone could stay silent forever. Among the survivors, a few dared to write down what they saw, not as priests or officials, but as witnesses. And one of them, a woman named Katherina Hennot, would soon change everything. Because she did what no one else had done before, she outlived the Spanish donkey and turned the church's own ledgers against it. Katherina Hennot should have died on the wedge. By every rule of the Inquisition, by every calculation of weight and angle, she was supposed to last no more than 6 hours. But she survived. In 1627, Cologne, a city wrapped in smoke and incense, where trials for witchcraft had become a weekly ritual. Katherina was 51, a widow, and one of the wealthiest women in the city. She owned 4 businesses, a bakery, a textile shop, 2 rental houses, and she had refused to sell any of them to the local monastery. Within a month, rumors began. Her bread smelled strange. Her workers whispered about unclean blessings. One morning, she woke to find soldiers outside her door. The charge was witchcraft. The sentence already written. They stripped her of everything before the trial began: her jewelry, her ledgers, her deeds. Her servants were dismissed, her home sealed. By the time she was led into the chamber, the paperwork of her ruin was already complete. But Katherina didn't confess, not in the first hour, not in the second, not even when her body began to break. The executioner hesitated. He had seen hundreds of women collapse, faint, beg. Katherina only stared at him, her mouth too dry to form words, her eyes refusing to plead. By the 6th hour, she was still breathing. That made her dangerous, because survival meant possibility. Outside the chamber, her son, a lawyer, had gathered witnesses. He threatened to sue the bishop's court in civil court, demanding access to financial records. That single act terrified the church more than any scream, because if the ledgers were opened, the pattern would be exposed. Every accusation, every death, every confession followed by the same transaction. So they stopped the execution. For the first time, the donkey was lowered without finishing its work. Katherina was taken to her cell, still alive. Her body was shattered, but her mind was clear. And when she recovered, she began to write. Over the next 3 years, she compiled a document now known as the Ledger of Cologne, a list of every Spanish donkey execution in her city. For each victim, she recorded 3 things: the name, the survival time, and what became of their property. She wrote it not as revenge, but as proof. A mirror held up to an empire built on the screams of women. Her ledger documented more than 300 cases. In almost every one, the same pattern repeated. The victim was female. She owned land, business, or inheritance. Her trial lasted less than 2 days, and within 24 hours of her execution, her estate was reassigned to the church or a male relative allied with it. Katherina's writing was simple, factual, almost clinical. No emotion, no poetry, just entries like this. Maria Elsner, 44, baker, confessed under duress after 5 hours. Property transferred to Abbey of St. Clair. Anna Reich, 37, widow, survived 3 hours. No confession. Property sold by order of Bishop Clemens. Each line was a wound disguised as ink. Her son smuggled the document across city borders, hiding copies in law offices and private libraries. For years, it circulated quietly, passed from scholar to scholar, whispered among reformers. It wasn't until the 19th century that historians rediscovered it in the Cologne archives. Even then, half its pages were missing. Some were burned, others torn, but enough survived to reveal the truth. The Spanish donkey was not an isolated cruelty. It was a financial system disguised as faith. Historians like Dr. Friedrich Morsba later confirmed what Katherina had written. By cross-referencing her ledger with property records, he found that 87% of the donkey's victims were women who owned something of value, not heretics, not criminals, just women with assets. In his report, Morsba wrote, "The Spanish donkey functioned as an instrument of redistribution, from female ownership to clerical wealth. It was a kind of economy that used pain as its currency. Confession was the receipt. Execution was the transaction. The church didn't need to invent new taxes. It simply created sin. Accusation was enough to seize control. Even when the victims were acquitted posthumously, which happened rarely, their property was never returned. It had already been purified." Katherina Hennot's survival exposed a logic so cold it bordered on genius. Every step of the process was justified by scripture, signed by law and recorded by hand. No blood went unaccounted for. No body was wasted. Pain became data. And yet, her act of survival changed the course of history. Her ledger was the first document to connect torture to profit, not as rumor, but as proof. It showed that behind the sermons about purity stood an empire of clerks, not priests. An empire that measured faith not in prayers, but in gold. By the time Katherina died, the church had quietly buried her name, but her words lived on. Hidden in archives, copied in secret, they became the seed of something far more dangerous than any heresy: truth. Because once the record spoke, silence could no longer protect the powerful. And what those records revealed next would shake Europe to its core. In 1998, historian Dr. Friedrich Morsba was studying the archives of Bamberg and Würzburg when he found something that changed him forever. At first, it was just a collection of dusty trial records, names, charges, dates. But when he compared those records with old tax ledgers and property deeds, a horrifying pattern emerged. He stopped sleeping. He said the paper itself seemed to scream. Over 5 years, Morsba analyzed 847 executions between 1627 and 1632, the height of the witch trials. Nearly 9 out of 10 victims were women, and 87% of them owned something valuable: land, livestock, gold, or a business. They weren't poor, they weren't powerless, they were independent, and that made them dangerous. The moment a woman was accused, her property froze. It was no longer hers. It became holy collateral, held by the church until spiritual resolution. The term appeared again and again, written in the same tight Latin script, collateralistic divinus. If she confessed, the property was purified and transferred permanently. If she refused, the property was confiscated for non-compliance. And if she died under torture, which most did, It went straight to the treasury. Every possible outcome benefited the same institution. The Spanish donkey was just one of the tools in that process, but it was the most efficient. It didn't require a crowd or a pyre. It could be done in silence, behind stone walls, with no need for firewood or guards. And most importantly, it left enough time for a confession to be written, signed, and notarized. That was the key. The signature. The illusion that the victim had given her property willingly. To the church, that signature turned theft into holiness. To history, it turned holiness into fraud. Mersba's findings revealed that entire dioceses ran like corporations. Each bishopric had its own ledger of purification, a book that balanced the cost of executions against the income from confiscations. He even found correspondence between two bishops discussing profitable years. One letter read, "The yield of souls this season exceeds expectation. Our coffers rejoice." They were talking about executions, as if pain itself were a harvest. In the margins of those ledgers, Mersba found notes in red ink. Donkey in use. Beside them were initials, likely those of executioners, and under each name the same words appeared. Property transferred. Over and over, hundreds of times. The deeper he read, the more the humanity drained out of the pages. They weren't accounts of people anymore. They were accounts of output. Columns of numbers, tidy sums of purified gold. There were even tables estimating how many florins could be recovered per execution. It was bureaucracy at its most monstrous, a belief system that had turned sin into a form of revenue. Mersba tried to publish his findings. The response from the church was silence. Then came the warnings, gentle at first, then legal. He was told the archives had been misinterpreted, that the documents were contextually misunderstood. But the math didn't lie. Pain had balance sheets. And those sheets matched Katherina hennot's 3-century-old ledger line by line. One surviving invoice from Würzburg listed payment to the executioner for operation of the Spanish apparatus. The amount, 12 florins. Beside it, the notation. Recovered property, 240 florins. The profit margin, 20-1. That was the real miracle. Not salvation, not purification. Profit. The numbers were staggering. Across just 2 bishoprics in 5 years, the total confiscated assets reached the equivalent of nearly $2 million modern dollars. And that's only the documented cases. Many others vanished completely, their records burned or altered. But every surviving line tells the same story. Faith weaponized as finance. When Mersba presented his research at a historical conference, someone asked him, "Do you think the church understood what it was doing?" He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said quietly, "They understood perfectly. That's why they wrote it down." Because systems that write everything down don't see evil. They see order. The Inquisition didn't hide its cruelty, it organized it. Pain was given categories, forms, subheadings. It could be filed, stamped, and archived. And centuries later, those files became its own undoing. The bones had decayed, but the ink survived. The very obsession with record-keeping that built the Inquisition was what allowed historians to expose it. In Bamberg, one of the ledgers remains open under glass. The entries are perfectly neat. Date, name, sentence, confession, transfer. 5 columns, 5 steps from accusation to profit. When you stand in front of it, it's not the handwriting that chills you, it's the calm. There's no hatred in those pages, no fury, no doubt, just precision. Because in that world, cruelty wasn't rage, it was paperwork. And for every page that survived, hundreds didn't. Burned, hidden, erased. But fragments remain, enough to reconstruct a pattern, enough to understand what was done, and enough to realize that this wasn't medieval madness. It was administration. It was the moment when belief stopped being faith and became business. But not all the record keepers stayed silent. One man, who had spent 18 years operating the Spanish donkey himself, would one day step out of the chamber and betray everything he served. And the diary he carried would ignite the scandal that finally forced the church to confront its own abyss. In 1689, a man walked into a monastery in Bavaria and demanded sanctuary. He was barefoot, filthy, trembling, but he carried something under his arm wrapped in cloth. When the monks unwrapped it, they found not a weapon, but a book. A thick leather-bound journal, its pages stiff with age and blood stains. The man's name was Hans Schmidt. For 18 years, he had served as the official executioner of Bamberg. He had operated the Spanish donkey 312 times. The diary contained every one of them. Each entry followed the same format: date, name, crime, duration, and the church officials who attended. But what set it apart were the final 2 columns. The first, wager placed. The second, winner. The monks who read it refused to believe what they saw. The bishops had been betting on how long women would survive. One entry read, June 17th, 1683. Victim, Elsa Hoffmann, age 44. Crime, witchcraft. Survival time, 5 hours, 22 minutes. Weight added, 35 pounds. Present, Bishop Ferner, Canon fled, Canon Neudecker. Wager, 50 guilders. Winner, Canon fled, closest to 5 hours, 30 minutes. The handwriting was clean, professional, no sign of emotion. For Hans, this wasn't confession, it was accounting. He had recorded each scream like a number, each death like an entry on a balance sheet. But as he aged, something shifted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet knowledge that he had spent his life turning women into entertainment for men who called themselves holy. When Schmidt's diary was published a year later, it detonated across Europe. Newspapers printed fragments of his notes, and within weeks, riots erupted in Bavaria. Churches were vandalized, priests were attacked, and 3 bishops fled to France. The Holy Roman Emperor demanded an inquiry. Even the Pope, Innocent XII, had to intervene. For the first time in history, the Inquisition wasn't accused of heresy or excess. It was accused of gambling. And not just any gambling, wagering on the endurance of human suffering. The church called the diary a forgery. Then, quietly, it verified that most of the names were real. Hans Schmidt was arrested, interrogated, and eventually got hanged. His final words, according to a witness, were, "They told me to record the time. I thought they meant for God." But his diary survived. hidden by the same monks who granted him sanctuary. Today, it sits in the Bavarian State Library in Munich. Its spine is cracked, its ink brown with centuries. You can still read the numbers in the margins. Survival times underlined in red. 4 hours, 5 hours, 17 hours, 43 minutes. Each line is both a document and a scream. Schmidt's records revealed something deeper than cruelty, a system that had lost all sense of God. The priests who once preached salvation had turned pain into sport. When a woman lasted longer than expected, they called it miraculous endurance. When she died early, they blamed her lack of faith. Either way, they drank wine afterward. One account describes the chamber after an execution, the wedge still wet, the rope still swinging, the men laughing, collecting their winnings, one of them toasting, to the strength of the flesh, another answering, to the purity of the soul. Schmidt wrote that sometimes between wages, the bishops would order adjustments to the torture, adding or removing weights depending on their bets. If a woman was dying too fast, they lightened the load to prolong her agony. If she was lasting too long, they increased it to ensure a clean finish. It was pain by design. And every moment, every adjustment was being watched, not by God, but by gamblers in robes. The scandal spread faster than the church could contain it. The Pope issued a formal ban on the Spanish donkey in 1692, citing grave abuse and corruption of holy office. But the ban came too late. By then, hundreds of devices were already in circulation across Europe. Local courts ignored the decree, continuing in secret. The donkey had become too profitable, too effective, too ordinary to disappear overnight. And even as public outrage grew, one fact remained. The same hands that had condemned witches were still signing property transfers. The church lost face, not fortune. But Hans Schmidt's diary changed something fundamental. It exposed the mechanics, not of torture, but of complicity. How faith could become performance and morality, bookkeeping. How the greatest sin wasn't the act of cruelty itself, but the calm, administrative silence that followed it. When modern historians read the diary, they describe the feeling as clinical dread, because what chills you most isn't the gore, it's the order. The perfect penmanship, the symmetry of the columns, the absence of guilt. You realize you're not looking at madness. You're looking at management. The donkey had started as a tool of fear. It ended as proof that fear itself can be organized, refined into policy, automated into routine. The Pope's ban silenced the betting, but it didn't stop the machine. For another 180 years, the Spanish donkey would continue to reappear in Spain, in rural France, even in small towns in Italy. Always the same shape, always the same purpose. Because what Hans Schmidt exposed was not just a device. It was an idea that power can sanctify anything, even the sound of a woman being torn in half. And the world, once it learned that truth, could never look at faith the same way again. The news of Hans Schmidt's diary reached Rome in the spring of 1690. By then, Bavaria was in flames, not from war, but from outrage. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "No more wages," and "The church feeds on blood." In some towns, villagers stormed courthouses and dragged the wooden wedges into the open air, burning them in front of cathedrals. They didn't know how many had died on them, only that the screams had become unbearable. In the Vatican, panic rippled through marble halls. The Pope's secretaries carried copies of Schmidt's diary, translating the Latin notes into Italian for review. The reports were too detailed to deny. Names of bishops, canon officials, even the times of day when executions took place, all matched existing records. There was no escape in silence now. For 3 months, the Curia debated how to contain the disaster. The Church faced its most dangerous enemy: documentation. The same ledgers that had legitimized its authority had turned against it. On July 12, 1692, Pope Innocent XII issued a papal bull, De Instrumentis Poenitentiae, on the instruments of penance. It condemned the profane use of devices contrary to the sanctity of faith, and banned the Spanish donkey under penalty of excommunication. But between its lines was a more revealing truth. The bull didn't outlaw torture itself, only the gambling. In private, Vatican advisors made it clear the problem wasn't the suffering, it was the scandal. Public outrage threatened donations, pilgrimages, and the illusion of divine order. The Church could tolerate pain, but not bad publicity. So they launched what historians now call the cleansing of the ledgers. Over the next decade, officials across Europe were ordered to destroy all records of inquisitorial torture devices. Files were burned, court archives sealed, even tomb inscriptions erased. Some priests were quietly reassigned, others disappeared. In Bamberg, the chamber that once held the Spanish donkey was filled with dirt and turned into a wine cellar. Visitors were told it had never existed, but people remembered. Mothers whispered to their daughters, "Don't anger the priest. Don't speak too loud. The donkey still waits." The fear didn't vanish with the fire. It went underground. In 1695, 3 years after the ban, a merchant travelling through rural Spain recorded a strange sight in his journal. In a small village outside Seville, he saw a procession carrying a statue of the Virgin, and beside the church, 2 men were repairing what looked like a carpenter's sawhorse with a wedge-shaped beam. When he asked what it was for, the locals fell silent. Then one muttered, "Purification." Even after prohibition, the ritual endured. Officially, the church claimed the donkey was gone. Unofficially, it lived on. In basements, outposts, frontier towns, far from Rome's supervision. Like a superstition, too useful to die. By the early 1700s, the Inquisition began to decline. Its power fractured under the weight of Enlightenment philosophy and growing secular courts. But even as reason spread, the old logic lingered. That pain cleanses, that fear teaches, that control justifies cruelty. Europe didn't abandon the donkey. It merely modernized it. The wood was replaced by steel, the wedge by prisons, the executioner by bureaucracy. The shape changed, the principle remained. In Rome, the scandal never truly ended. Behind closed doors, cardinals debated whether to issue an apology. But to apologize meant to acknowledge, and acknowledgement risked collapse. So they rewrote history instead. They called the diary a fabrication, the gambling isolated, and the victims tragic misunderstandings. But the evidence refused to die. Copies of Schmidt's diary kept resurfacing, in German, French, Latin, reprinted by dissidents and historians alike. Each rediscovery reopened the wound. By the mid-18th century, the The Spanish donkey had become a ghost of Europe's conscience, the symbol of what happens when institutions lose their humanity. Pain became the price of order, and order became sacred. A letter from a Jesuit scholar to his superior in 1740 captured the sentiment perfectly. We buried the instruments, but not the idea. The world still believes in holy pain. We have simply given it new names. That was the legacy of Hans Schmidt's diary. It wasn't just the proof of cruelty, it was the mirror of complicity. It showed how entire civilizations could sanctify violence, as long as it was written neatly, blessed properly, and profited the right hands. When modern historians visit the archives today, they describe a strange silence. The walls of those chambers are bare, the ledgers half burned, the ink faded to rust. But if you listen closely, the silence itself feels heavy, as if the air remembers what was done there. Because evil doesn't always die with exposure. Sometimes it simply learns to whisper. And in that whisper, you can still hear the same rhythm the wedge once kept. A slow, methodical descent. The sound of power teaching itself to forget. After the scandal, Rome promised reform. But reform never came from repentance. It came from curiosity. When the church could no longer gamble on agony, it began to study it. In the early 1700s, physicians who once served the Inquisition quietly repurposed their knowledge. They called it Physiologia Divina, divine physiology. It was the idea that the endurance of pain revealed the limits of the human soul, that suffering itself was a kind of experiment. Under this new language, torture didn't vanish. It simply changed profession. Doctors replaced executioners, and anatomy replaced theology. In one Bavarian document dated 1713, a physician named Dr. Johannes Schulthus described the Spanish donkey not as punishment, but as a rare opportunity for observation. He wrote, "The subject, still alive, presents the muscular contraction most suited for empirical study of resistance to impalement. He wasn't alone. Throughout Germany, France, and Spain, university anatomists attended executions to take notes. Pulse rate, breathing patterns, time to fainting, and color of the eyes before death. Some even timed how long the heart continued beating after consciousness faded. They called these natural miracles. Pain had become data. Schulthus's own work would one day be published under a misleading title, Observationes Anatomicae, or Anatomical Observations. Hidden in its appendix were 23 pages about the donkey, pages that no medical historian could stomach without horror. He described the angle of penetration, the tearing of tissue, the muscular sealing that slowed blood loss. He noted how the victim's body instinctively tried to resist the wedge, tightening around it, prolonging life instead of ending it. For him, this was proof of divine design, that even in pain, the body obeyed order. But what Schulthus documented was not divinity, it was efficiency. He discovered that by adding 10-pound weights to each ankle after 90 minutes, the descent could be controlled. Too much weight, and the victim bled out in minutes. Too little, and the process stalled. With precision, he could extend survival from 4 hours to 8, sometimes even more. He wrote this with pride, as though he had improved a surgical technique. When modern forensic pathologists translated his manuscript in 2003, they could barely continue reading. The drawings were worse than the text. They showed cross-sections of the human pelvis, arrows marking muscle groups, detailed notes on the gradual displacement of internal organs. These weren't autopsies. These were observations of living agony. And Schulthus wasn't the only one. Records uncovered in Vienna, Seville, and Lyon reveal that at least 20 other physicians submitted similar reports between 1700 and 1760, all under the guise of scientific advancement. They were the heirs of the Inquisition's bureaucracy, men who no longer needed faith to justify cruelty, only curiosity. Their work gave birth to something new, the idea that human suffering could be quantified. It was the birth of modern forensic medicine, the same field that would later help abolish torture. But its origins were written in blood. In 1748, a Parisian doctor named Claude Delamare wrote to a colleague, "We no longer burn for faith, we measure for knowledge." It was meant as progress. It was, instead, the perfect continuity. The Church called these doctors assistants of truth. Their presence lent torture a scientific sheen. If a physician observed the process, it was no longer cruelty. It was procedure. Reports were filed, signed, and stored under the heading "Experiments on the Durability of Life." Once again, bureaucracy had found a way to cleanse conscience. To the victims, the difference didn't matter. The rope felt the same, the wood smelled the same, the screams echoed the same. But for the men taking notes, something profound had shifted. They no longer saw bodies as sacred, only as systems. Each contraction, each drop of sweat, each tremor of the eyelid was an equation. And the wedge beneath them was a measuring tool. One survivor, a woman from Regensburg whose torture was interrupted by plague quarantine, later described what she saw in her final testimony. "They watched not my pain, but my breathing. They whispered numbers. When I cried for mercy, they told me to hold still." It is one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of the donkey from a living witness. Her words cut through the centuries because they expose what everyone else tried to hide. That by turning agony into science, humanity vanished from the room. The physicians claimed to seek enlightenment, but the only light in those chambers came from candles burning beside a dying woman. Their observations, their diagrams, their journals, all part of the same pattern the Church had perfected. Transform suffering into data, and no one has to call it evil. When the Age of Reason finally dawned, Europe looked back on this period with disgust. But by then, the damage was already woven into the foundation of modern thought. Because the same principles that once measured the endurance of pain would later measure productivity, obedience, and control. The Spanish donkey had disappeared, but its logic remained. Pain, once sanctified by faith, was now justified by science. And for those who built the future, the lesson was clear. You don't need a cross or a crown to rule by fear, only the authority to measure it. By the late 1700s, Europe was changing. The Enlightenment promised light, reason, and liberty. But its glow never reached the underground chambers where the donkey once stood. Those rooms were bricked over, renamed, forgotten. And yet, the silence they left behind shaped the world more than the light ever did. The Church had banned the Spanish donkey a century earlier, but in remote towns and noble estates, it lingered. Witnesses spoke of wagons carrying wooden altars through side roads at night, escorted by priests. Inquisition manuals were burned publicly, but their content, the methods, the angles, the calculations, survived in private notebooks of physicians, magistrates, and state interrogators. The wedge had gone, but the system had not. By the dawn of the 19th century, pain had found new administrators. The state. Monarchs and empires no longer needed religion to sanctify cruelty. They had bureaucracy. The same ledgers once used to record holy confessions were now used to track prisoners, factory workers, and soldiers. The numbers changed, but the logic stayed intact. Every scream had a purpose. Every life could be accounted for. It was the birth of what modern historians call the secular Inquisition, the quiet continuation of the same power structure, now under the banner of progress. When Napoleon's legal reforms standardized imprisonment, the Catholic rituals of purification reappeared as rehabilitation. When British factories punished workers for lateness by docking wages, it was discipline dressed as efficiency. And when new prisons began using solitary confinement as moral correction, it was simply the donkey without wood, invisible, sterile, modern. The Inquisition had taught Europe one lasting truth. Pain works. It extracts obedience. It manufactures silence. And silence keeps systems running. Historians rarely draw the line, but the pattern is unmistakable. The same Europe that once cheered public torture in cathedral squares now built bureaucracies that produced quiet suffering behind stone walls. They no longer needed executioners. They had clerks. A stroke of a pen replaced the drop of a rope. The ledgers remained. When Hans Schmidt's diary resurfaced in 1820, long after his death, the Church condemned it again. Not because it was false, but because it was inconveniently true. The same year, a Spanish village carried out what is now recognized as the last recorded donkey execution. A woman accused of infanticide was tied above the wedge in a barn and left to die while the local priest recited prayers. Her name was never written down. Her body was buried outside the cemetery fence, marked only by a pile of stones. The official record called it an act of mercy. That phrase, act of mercy, appears hundreds of times in the archives of post-Inquisition Europe. It meant a confession obtained, a soul cleansed, a system preserved. Mercy had become another word for control. When archaeologists unearthed one of the last donkey devices in rural Spain in 1874, they found it wrapped in cloth and hidden behind a false wall of a chapel. The wood was dark, polished by blood and age. The top ridge was smooth from years of use. Beneath it, they discovered scraps of parchment, fragments of Latin prayers. Someone had blessed the device after every death, as if sanctifying horror could erase it. The newspapers of the time called it a medieval relic. They were wrong. It wasn't medieval. It had been used that same year. The wedge had survived the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and the birth of modern law. The world simply stopped looking. Silence had done its job. When the Vatican received the report of the discovery, it responded with one sentence: "There is no record of such practices in our history." And with that, the Church closed the file, the final act of denial in a story centuries long. But the silence couldn't last forever. As new nations rose, as revolutions shook Europe, and as people began to speak of rights instead of souls, those buried records began to matter again. The diaries, the ledgers, the manuals, all the evidence of systematized agony, became fuel for a new idea, that human suffering could not be justified, not by faith, not by science, not by profit. The very horror that once enforced obedience began to awaken rebellion. The Spanish donkey, once an emblem of order, became a symbol of everything civilization vowed never to repeat. And yet, beneath that vow, the same moral question lingered, the same one whispered in Bamberg's chamber centuries earlier. If power can make cruelty look righteous, how would we know if we are doing the same? Because the donkey's greatest legacy wasn't the pain it caused, it was the silence it taught. The habit of looking away, of calling evil necessary, of letting the ledger speak louder than the scream. And that silence, refined, institutionalized, and inherited, would travel far beyond the ruins of Europe. It would cross oceans, infiltrate colonies, and whisper through the laws of nations that promised freedom while counting bodies. The wedge was gone, but the shape it left in history, that thin, sharp line between justice and cruelty, was carved too deep to ever fade. By the late 19th century, the world wanted to forget. The Industrial Revolution had rewritten the language of progress. Steam, steel, and statistics replaced incense and prayer. Factories rose where cathedrals once stood. But the logic inside them was the same. Obedience through exhaustion, control through precision, profit through pain. The Inquisition had ended, but its rhythm still pulsed in the engines of modernity. When the last Spanish donkey was found in 1874, newspapers described it with fascination, not horror. Illustrated engravings showed the device as a curiosity of the Dark Ages, a mistake humanity had outgrown. But that was a lie. The same year, prisons in Britain and France were experimenting with prolonged standing punishment, and in colonial outposts, administrators tested new, disciplinary techniques to subdue labourers. The materials had changed, not the mindset. A British reformer named Henry Fielding visited Spain in 1880 and wrote, "They claim such machines no longer exist, but I saw the spirit of them in every cell, every silent corridor." The spirit of the wedge, the belief that pain could be useful, had survived every ban, every reform, every sermon. By the turn of the 20th century, Europe's conscience tried to heal itself through memory. Museums displayed torture devices as relics of ignorance, yet they were always shown without names. No victims, no biographies, only the instruments. Steel hooks under glass, wedges behind velvet rope. Visitors whispered, shuddered, and bored on. But, buried in archives, some scholars refused to let the silence win. One of them was Professor Marta Kleiner, who, in 1927, published The Instruments of Faith and Fear, comparing inquisitorial ledgers with modern judicial codes. Her conclusion was simple, devastating. The state did not abolish torture, it inherited it. Kleiner's work was banned within a year, but her argument endured, because everywhere she looked, from military discipline to colonial governance, she saw the same blueprint the donkey had perfected. Pain made predictable, obedience made measurable, even the language had survived. Where the church once spoke of purification, modern governments spoke of rehabilitation. Where inquisitors wrote of confession, judges demanded cooperation. And where executioners once calibrated weights, doctors now measured endurance in laboratories. Every age believed it was enlightened. Every age found new ways to justify cruelty. Then came 1940, when the world looked into the death camps of Europe. It saw its own reflection. Centuries of refinement in the machinery of pain. The ledger had become industrial. The wedge had become policy. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the survivors' testimonies echoed something ancient. They spoke of doctors observing agony, of bureaucrats timing death, of silence mistaken for duty. The parallels were unmistakable. The Inquisition had written the script. The 20th century had only scaled it up. It was in that reckoning that the modern idea of human rights was born. During the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, one article stood out. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. That single sentence, so brief and absolute, was the gravestone of the Spanish donkey. The drafters didn't cite it by name, but they knew. Several of them had studied European history. They had seen the ledgers, the manuals, the diaries. They knew what happens when pain becomes policy. The same principle appeared in the 8th Amendment of the US Constitution. No cruel or unusual punishment. It was written by men who had read accounts of inquisitorial torture, determined that their new republic would not repeat the old world's sins. Even the Geneva Conventions, decades later, would carry the same echo. The belief that civilization cannot coexist with systematic pain. And yet, the irony endures. The world swore never again, and then built prisons, black sites, and interrogation rooms that whispered the same prayers in different tongues. Every generation rediscovers the donkey under a new name. When Professor Kleiner's granddaughter visited the Munich archives in 1993, she described the experience in her diary. The books are cold to the touch. You feel as if the ink remembers. I stood in front of Hans Schmidt's handwriting and realized the line between justice and cruelty has never closed. It only shifts. History moves forward, but its shadow always leans backward. The Spanish donkey taught power how to disguise itself, how to speak softly while it crushes. From the church's purity to the state's security, from the scientist's observation to the bureaucrat's efficiency, the names change, the posture remains. In the quiet rooms of Bamberg Castle, archaeologists once uncovered a single wooden fragment, blackened and smooth. It was placed in a museum under sterile light, labeled simply, Device 17th Century. No mention of Anna Schwarz, no mention of Katherina Hennot, no mention of the 847 names Hans Schmidt wrote before his hand began to tremble. But if you press your palm against the glass, you can still see it. That faint, sharp edge where belief met profit, and civilization learned to cut itself in half. The wedge was never just wood, it was a mirror, and we are still looking into it. Bamberg today is quiet. Tourists walk its cobbled streets, drinking wine by the river, never knowing that beneath their feet lie vaults once blackened by smoke and screams. The castle's basement, where Anna Schwarz met the wedge, is sealed now, repurposed into a storage room. But every so often, workmen claim they hear echoes when they drill into the old foundation. A hollow resonance, like air trapped inside stone. Historians call it coincidence. Locals call it memory. Because memory is not gentle. It survives like a bruise beneath time's skin. In 1998, a team of archaeologists reopened the lower tunnels of Bamberg Castle for restoration. What they found wasn't dramatic. A few wood fragments, rusted nails, scraps of parchment. But one piece changed everything. A splinter of oak, 8 inches wide, its tip carved at exactly 45 degrees. The same angle described in the Inquisition manuals. The same perfection of pain. Tests confirmed what the ledgers had already told us. The donkey had stood there, and it had been used. They also found bones. Fragments of pelvis, ribs, fingers. Too few for a full skeleton, but enough to prove what history tried to forget. The remains of 3 women, all between 20 and 40. No markers, no coffins, buried directly into the dirt, as if the church wanted even their deaths to be unrecorded. Yet, the soil remembered what the ink had denied. When the discovery was announced, the church issued a brief statement expressing regret for the tragedies of history. 2 sentences, then silence. It was the same silence that had buried Anna, Margareta, Katherina, and hundreds more. But others refused that silence. Historians began to hold small vigils in Bamberg each year. No speeches, no banners, just candles and the reading of names from the surviving ledgers. Some names are partial, others misspelled, most lost. Still, they read them aloud. It takes hours. One name always comes first. Anna Schwarz. The woman who screamed so long that an empire learned to measure time by her pain. The woman whose executioner thought he was recording divine order. In a letter discovered in the Vatican archives, one anonymous priest wrote after witnessing her death, "I could not pray. I felt the devil not in her, but in us." That letter was never sent, but the words survived, folded between pages of a sermon book, as if someone wanted them to be found later, a confession across centuries. Standing in that chamber today, there is no blood, no rope, no wedge, only damp walls, faint etchings, and the smell of old earth. But if you whisper, your voice seems to come back to you a little too clearly, as if the room is listening. That's the real legacy of the Spanish donkey. Not the wood or the metal, but the echo. It's the echo that lives in every system that believes pain can fix people. It's the echo that haunts every courtroom that calls punishment correction. It's the echo that whispers every time someone says it's for their own good. The donkey's victims didn't die for faith. They died because the powerful needed a language of control, and their bodies became its grammar. The ledgers, the manuals, the diaries, all of them were the church's syntax for obedience, and that syntax still lives inside our institutions today. Modern governments record their cruelties in spreadsheets, not parchment. They measure efficiency instead of faith, profit instead of purity. But the structure remains, a system that needs suffering to function. Only the vocabulary has changed. Every age promises that its violence is justified. Medieval men called it holiness. Industrialists called it order. Democracies call it security. But the bones beneath Bamberg don't care what name you give it. They know the truth. They have seen how civilization always writes its progress in pain. One candle burns in that chamber each year, lit by a historian who refuses to let the memory fade. She says it's not for mourning, it's for witness. Because witnessing is the only antidote to silence. When the flame flickers, it casts shadows that look almost like movement, the illusion of figures turning, rising, breathing. Perhaps it's just the draft from the tunnels. Perhaps it's something else. Either way, the moment you stand there, you understand what the old phrase truly means. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. They do not speak in words. They speak in unease. They speak in the pause between your breaths, in the shame that lingers when you walk away. They remind us that history is not a story of cruelty past. It's a warning of cruelty rehearsed. Every silence, every justification, every calm bureaucratic sentence can grow teeth again if no one listens. So we listen, not out of pity, but out of duty. Because their suffering was recorded not to glorify pain, but to remind us what happens when pain becomes normal. And as long as there are those who still open the ledgers, still light the candles, still say the names, the wedge remains broken, and the bones, mercifully, refuse to rest. History always ends the same way, with paper. A decree, a ban, a law. But behind every signature, there's a body that paid for the ink. The Spanish donkey disappeared from Europe in the 19th century, but its shape lived on. In the courtroom, in the prison, in the quiet logic of control. What began as a wedge of wood became a pattern that civilization could not stop repeating. The belief that order must be earned through pain. It was this belief that inspired the inquisitors, justified the kings, and later disciplined the modern citizen. It was the same moral equation written in different language, for purification, for correction, for protection. Every era found its own way to make cruelty sound necessary. The bones in Bamberg are ancient, but their message is not. They speak in the silence of refugee camps, in overcrowded cells, in the calm tone of officials who say, "This is unfortunate, but required." And that phrase, required, is the descendant of every confession ever forced on the Spanish donkey. Because the danger was never the wedge itself. The danger was the system that could look at pain and see procedure. The horror of the Spanish donkey is not that it existed, it's that it was documented, measured, audited, perfected. It was organized cruelty, designed by intelligent men who thought they were serving truth. And once pain is organized, it becomes invisible. It becomes normal. It becomes law. That's why the story of Anna Schwarz, Margareta Herber, Katherina Hennot, and the hundreds who followed matters. They were not heretics. They were not warnings. They were evidence, proof that even in the most civilized societies, morality can be rewritten to serve power. The question that opened this story: when faith turns pain into currency, what kind of civilization does it create? Has only one answer. It creates one that mistakes suffering for order and silence for peace. But history offers another truth, a smaller one, hidden between the lines of ledgers and diaries, that every system, no matter how ruthless, eventually writes its own confession. The Inquisition thought it was recording obedience, but what it really left behind was guilt. Centuries of it, pressed into parchment. Every ledger that listed property transfers also listed crimes too vast to name. And those crimes have a strange power. They don't vanish. They whisper through time until someone listens. That's why the bones still speak, not as ghosts but as evidence. They are reminders that morality without empathy becomes machinery, and that civilization without memory becomes repetition. In the end, the Spanish donkey did something no one intended. It forced humanity to define the limits of cruelty. From its ashes came the first sentences in modern law that said, "No one shall be subjected to torture." That sentence exists because of them, because of the women who screamed until the world had to invent compassion just to justify listening. It is easy to call the past barbaric. It is harder to ask what of it survives inside us. Every time a government hides a crime behind classified files, every time an institution chooses profit over mercy, every time a person says, "That's just the way it is," the wedge moves again, quietly, invisibly. The line between justice and cruelty tilts, and we pretend not to notice. But remembering is resistance, not forgiveness, not revenge, just the refusal to let silence finish the story. At the end of her life, Katherina Hennot wrote one final line in her ledger. Her handwriting was weak, almost fading. "We write so they cannot say they did not know." That sentence outlived every priest who condemned her, every bishop who bet on death, every king who claimed righteousness. It outlived the donkey, the fire, the ledgers, and even the walls that tried to hide them. And it still lives, in every book, every law, every person who dares to look back without turning away. The wedge split more than bodies. It split the world, between those who could feel another's pain and those who could profit from it. That divide is the real inheritance of the Inquisition. It is the true border between justice and cruelty. And as long as we keep drawing that line, as long as we remember the sound of the ledger closing and the silence that followed, then maybe, just maybe, the next generation won't need to learn compassion from screams. Because history has already paid the price.